So in this question, we want to look at the data over here and answer a few questions that we've been asked about this data. So the first question is saying that in 1969, actual real GDP was greater than potential GDP, and we want to answer why and how this could be the case. So actual GDP is greater than potential GDP, and this implies that the economy is actually operating beyond its normal capacity. For example, large increases in investment for that year might have caused this kind of situation. And as you can see, the unemployment rate itself is already very low. And in a situation like this, structurally and frictionally unemployed workers would be able to get jobs as well. Part B. Even though real GDP in 1970 was slightly greater than real GDP in 1969, the unemployment rate increased substantially from 1969 to 1970. So why did this increase in unemployment occur? Now, real GDP is slightly greater than in 1969 and 1970, but potential GDP is greater in 1969 than it is in 1970 relative to the actual real GDP. This implies that the firms were actually operating below a normal capacity. Employment is below than full capacity employment. Thus, the rate of unemployment is high in 1970 and lower in the year 1969. Part C. Was the inflation rate in 1970 likely to have been higher or lower than the inflation rate in 1969? And does this answer depend on whether the recession that began in December 1969 was caused by a change in a component of aggregate demand or by supply shock? So the economy was operating below potential levels or the normal levels in 1970. And the most obvious cause for this would have been a lack of aggregate demand or some negative change in the components of aggregate demand. As we know, a decrease in GDP for potential levels results in a decrease in price level. That is why the inflation rate in 1970 is actually lower than in 1969, and that's the conclusion that we can make out of this. The recession that began in 1969 was due to a decrease in aggregate demand and not a supply shock, since the supply shock would actually have led to a higher inflation rate in 1970.